Tonight on Dr. Phil Primetime. Should transgender athletes compete in women's sports?
Going through male puberty puts you at a biological advantage.
Trans women are women, so let's just be clear. There's no amount of hormones that will ever erase the biological advantage that you have.
The advantages of height, wingspan, bone strength.
What you're showing me are male statistics, and trans women are not male.
Tonight, it's one of the most controversial issues in America. Should transgender athletes compete in women's sports? Over 20 states have passed laws restricting transgender participation in sports. The NCAA, Olympic Committee, and even high school athletic associations are scrambling to keep up. Supporters say excluding transgender athletes is discrimination. Opponents say, no, 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 the science is clear. Biological males, even after transition, have advantages in strength, speed, and endurance. So what's the right policy? Is there a fair solution for everyone? We'll hear from all sides. First, Linnea was a top college track star, but now is in a different kind of race. The fight to keep transgender athletes out of women's sports. Linnea is 26 years old now, but during her collegiate days at 20 years old was really accomplished as a track star at Southern Utah University and is joining us now. Linnea, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you about this issue.
Well, I know it's a big issue for you, and back in 2020, did you compete against trans athletes in the NCAA?
Yes, I was forced to compete against the first male-to-female transgender athlete in NCAA Division I. This was an athlete that had previously competed in the male category for 3 years before taking a redshirt year, their senior year, and then coming back to compete against the women in the female category.
Okay, now I understand that at least now and on paper, if it's properly monitored and attended to, that in order for a male that's transitioning to compete in NCAA athletics, they have to go through 2 years of hormonal treatment, testosterone blockers, whatever is the process to do that for 2 years. But what you're saying is this was an elite athlete that was competing for 3 years with the men, redshirted for 1 year, and then came back and competed on the women's side. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. In their case, it would have been the 2018 to 2019 season. At the time, the NCAA was utilizing their policies in their 2013 Transgender Inclusivity Handbook, which at the time, in my opinion, was written on a farce because there were no trans athletes competing within the NCAA at that time. So just taking a year off, not having to come back and prove to the NCAA that you're actually taking your hormone suppression, that you're actually taking the testosterone blockers. It was just you, a private practice physician of your choosing, and the NCAA said, okay, you're cleared, you can come back and compete, and that was that.
Okay, and you thought it was completely unfair, and you think it's unfair across the board?
Correct. I think that if you are taking a Division I scholarship as a male-bodied individual competing as a Division I athlete on the men's team for 3 years, coming back and then transitioning to compete as a female is completely unfair. As you mentioned in your intro, that men are biologically faster, stronger, have a larger bone density, more lung capacity. They are biologically more equipped to be athletic, opposed to ourselves. So giving them the opportunity to just quickly and swiftly, however, transition to becoming a female is completely unfair. Going through male puberty puts you at a biological advantage. That is why there are separation of sex in sports. That is why Title IX was created, because women deserve a fair and honest playing field. And by allowing biological men to compete against us, it's no longer fair, nor is it safe.
All right, so you look this athlete up when he was competing Division I on the men's side, and his event was the 800 meter, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And his last time that you saw on the 800 meters was 1 minute and 54 seconds, right?
Correct.
And how did that stack up to your time as the defending 800 meter champion?
Just the season prior, I had won the 800 meter outdoor championship for the Big Sky Conference Champions. I had ran a time of 2 minutes and 5 seconds, which was a leading time in Big Sky history. It put me in the top 5 for the record books of fastest all-time women within the conference. And that was still 11 seconds slower than what Jonathan had competed previously as a male.
For people that don't know, those are the most elite athletes in college is Division I. Doesn't mean Division II and III aren't significant athletes, they are, but there are certain qualifying times for you to even be considered for Division I. And you were not only Division I, but you won. You had the championship time for that year for Big Sky and one of the top 5 of all time. And his last time competing was 11 seconds better than your time.
Yes. So just looking at what you just explained, seeing how there's individuals saying that it isn't unfair to allow biological men to compete in women's sports, you can see that this male-bodied individual that had taken a Division I scholarship, that had competed on the men's team for 3 years, just transitioning over, only a year worth of hormone suppression is not going to equate to the equal levels of that as a female athlete. We are at the top tier level of our sport, as you mentioned, and to know that I was never going to step out onto an equal playing field ever again, regardless of the institution or the conference that I was a part of, because track and field is a nationwide sport. Every time that I step out onto that track, every time that I compete, every time that I put up a standing, that ranked me against every single Division I track and field athlete in that event across the country. So by them allowing a male-bodied individual to come in, it's not only affecting that one team, that one conference, but it's affecting the entirety of NCAA track and field female athletes across the country.
Okay, but now he spent a year taking hormones and testosterone blockers that are designed to downgrade his capabilities. So to compare him before he started any of that with where you were is not a one-to-one comparison, because he spent a year supposedly downgrading his capabilities. Was he downgraded when you competed against him?
So coming into the indoor season, it is a little bit different than the outdoor season. It's more difficult to run on indoor tracks. You don't run typically as fast as you do in outdoors. This athlete decided to run in the mile as opposed to the 800 in the indoor Big Sky Conference Championship. So I only had to face them in the distance medley relay, which is where they took their team from almost last place to second place. They would have easily made it all the way to first place if there wasn't such a large gap from when they received the baton. However, this athlete had also run in the mile earlier, completely dominated, beat the second place girl by almost 5 seconds, leaving the rest of the field in the dust. So it was very clear that they were not affected negatively by taking a year off of hormone suppression therapy.
All right, well, we'll talk about that some more. Coming up, I'm going to add to the conversation an activist who says inclusion is key, and Olympics should allow trans athletes, and we're going to give her an opportunity to tell us why. But first, Linnea's experience is just one of many stories among women athletes. Peyton was a high school volleyball player who suffered a concussion and neck injury after being hit by a ball spiked by an opposing trans athlete. You see these things happen, and people get upset because they don't seem to be on a level playing field. We'll talk about that after the break.
Neither I or my team or my administration agreed that we should be playing against a man, but at the time, again, this was 2 years ago, and we had no idea what to do. The game's almost over, and he goes up to spike the ball, and it comes right at me in the face, completely knocking me out, unconscious for about 30 seconds, while my body was in a fencing position on the floor, which is just how your body reacts to a brain injury. After I got hit, the whole gym went completely silent.
Tonight, we're tackling a heated debate. Should transgender athletes be allowed to compete in women's sports? Now, Linnea was one of the first athletes to raise a red flag after her college track team competed against a trans runner and lost during a championship conference meet. Now, you saw this coming, right? You weren't just ambushed by this. You knew this trans athlete was coming over and competing on the women's side in the Big Sky Conference, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The summer of 2019, when I reported back to university around August, as we start training for the cross-country season, my head coach had become aware. He pulled me to the side as he knew that an athlete that had previously competed in the male category in the 800 meter was going to be transitioning over and competing as a female. I was completely astonished that this was happening. I was confused that the NCAA was going to allow something like this to take place. I immediately went to my athletic director. I went to the general counsel of my university, the president of my university, and I said to them that I'm going to fight this and I hope that they are by my side. I'm super fortunate that the administration at my university was immensely supportive of my efforts. I reached out to the NCAA in the winter of 2019, explaining why this wasn't fair, imploring them to revisit the handbook that they had written back in 2013. And they essentially told me, thank you so much for reaching out. There's nothing that they could do about it, and that this male-bodied individual would indeed be competing against me and the rest of NCAA Division I runners across the country that season.
Did they give any reason? Did they give the basics of their decision, or just, hey, we're not changing it, there's nothing we can do about it?
According to the handbook, they stated that there is no biological advantage over being a male as opposed to a female athlete. So they referred back to that as it was written in the handbook.
You didn't go head-to-head in an individual event, but you did in a relay event, and you say that when that athlete got the baton, the athlete just ran off and left everybody else. True?
Correct. That is exactly what happened.
The athlete didn't run the 800, they ran the mile.
Yes, correct.
How did the athlete do in the mile?
They won first. There was no surprise there. They won by almost 5 seconds ahead of the second place runner that was, of course, a biological female athlete. So not only did they dominate the mile earlier that day, winning the championship for the 1600, they then came back and ran the same exact leg in the distance medley relay, took the team from almost last to second place. However, while this individual was competing in the distance medley relay, the coach said something, not words of encouragement, but something I'd never heard before, which was to slow down. It was becoming very clear that this athlete was competing at a caliber that the rest of the female runners could not keep up with. So instead of the coach telling them to keep going or keep pushing or try harder, the coach told her to slow down.
So you heard the coach tell this athlete, hey, you need to slow down.
Yes, I did.
What was the context of the comment?
Well, when you're running in races, I explain to other people at times, I always have my coach typically at the 200 meter mark for my 800. That's where he'll typically tell me my first 200 split, where he'll say something along the lines of right on pace or a little bit behind or a little bit too fast. However, I would never hear the words come out of his mouth to slow down. You're running a race, which means you're trying to run as fast as you possibly can. So the only reason that a coach in my mind would ever tell an athlete to slow down is because it was becoming increasingly visible to the other athletes as well as the spectators that this race was much easier to them as opposed to how it was to its opponents.
And now there has been an executive order from President Trump at a federal level that says transgender athletes may not participate in sports with women. Boys that are transitioning to girls, men that are transitioning to women, at whatever level it is, that's just not going to happen. Do you support that?
Yes, I was fortunate enough to be at the executive order signing with the president at the White House, along with a multitude of other athletes that have been standing at the forefront of this fight with me. It was an amazing victory for women and girls all across the country. I'm so lucky to have a president that's standing with us at the forefront of this issue. I'm sure that you saw that after that executive order signing, that the president, Charlie Baker of the NCAA, decided to come out with new policies around transgender athletes competing. However, it was not what we intended it to be. He is still allowing, from what I understand, male to female transgender athletes to practice and participate with female teams. However, they're no longer able to compete, which completely disregards the safety aspect of the fight. You should not be forced to change next to a fully intact male individual that is frankly an adult, and forcing a multitude of women to change, to practice, to put themselves in unsafe environments over and over again is the exact opposite of what we were shooting for. You showed that video of Peyton McNabb, who's become a wonderful friend of mine in this fight. Yes, that happened to her in a game. However, what happened to her could have very easily happened in practice. A male-bodied individual can very easily spike another female in the face during volleyball practice and put them in the same predicament. So pulling the competitive aspect out of the legislation and still allowing for these males to practice and to be around females is still half of the battle. So as fortunate as I am for President Trump signing that executive order on behalf of all of the women and girls, we still have a huge fight. Just recently, the Save Women's Sports Act in the Senate was reintroduced by Senator Tuberville, and we saw every single Democratic senator vote against the protection of women and girls in sports. So although we have a White House that is championing us, we have a multitude of battles left to fight in this.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're staying your course. Well, Blossom is joining us now and has been transitioning for 15 years and says trans women are women and should be included in female sports. Blossom is 38 and is a prominent trans activist and sees things very differently. Blossom, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Phil.
You've been listening to what we've been talking about so far, and you think that trans athletes should have an opportunity to practice, to play, to compete in the women's division of sports at all levels, correct?
Correct. Absolutely.
What do you say about the arguments like Linnea has been sharing that this is not a level playing field and that it's unfair to biological females because they just simply don't have the physiology that men have when they get into most sports?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, trans women are women. So let's just be clear. And we also have to remember there are some trans women athletes that have been beaten by cis women athletes. Leah Thomas is a prime example. And I also want us to remember the NCAA has regulations and rules that trans women have to meet when it comes to their hormone levels. They have to be within a certain range in order for them to compete with other women. And so with that being said, I just think it's really propaganda. The NCAA has over 510,000 athletes. And within those athletes, there are less than 10 trans athletes, which is only 0.002% of the population out of a population of trans people, which is only 1%. So actually, by the fact that Leah Thomas had been beaten by cis women, it actually debunks that trans women have a competitive edge over cis women. And when we talk about bone density levels, everybody's body chemistry is made differently. There are some cis women that have naturally higher testosterone levels than trans women because of something that we call genetics. When we talk about biology, genetics is biology, and we have to remember that. Some cis women experience transphobia. Iman Khalid is a prime example. The Algerian boxer who people thought was trans because she looked masculine, something that she can't control. And I think it's very dangerous when we put all women in a position to be tested to prove that they're not trans. And that executive order that Donald Trump signed is nothing more than waste and fraud, in my opinion. You're only signing for 0.002% of the population. You are subjecting all women, whether they're cis or trans, to rigorous tests to prove that they are not trans in order for them to play. And I think that was kind of left out of the conversation when we were thinking about this. And I think we have to bring it to the forefront. It's very, very important. All women can experience transphobia. All women can be affected by transphobia.
Well, I let you say everything you just said without interrupting you 1 second, but it just simply is not supported by science. I let you say everything you just said without interrupting you 1 second, but it just simply is not supported by science. And I don't know that I disagree with you about the number of trans athletes, because I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of the different levels and all the different sports, but there has been a tremendous amount of research done. I don't think it's so much the number of trans athletes, because there can be one athlete that can come into a conference like the Big Sky Conference, for example, and when they come into the Big Sky Conference, that one athlete can really erase a lot of really hard work and devotion and sacrifice that dozens, hundreds of women have spent years working on to achieve athletic heights. So it can take one that can really impact a number. And when you look at the science, and listen, it's not a matter of opinion, there are functional differences between biological men and biological women. Men have 57% better grip strength. They have 54% better quad strength. They have 89% more bicep strength. They have 90% more upper body strength. They have 33% higher vertical jumps. They have 162% more punching power. If you get into specific sports activities, in running, they tend to be 12% faster overall. And when you translate this into races, a man would finish a 3,000-meter track race about a minute faster. A 100-meter swim, a man would be about 5.7 seconds faster. A 200-meter swim, about 11.5 seconds faster. And the 800-meter swim, a minute faster. So when you look at those things, these are races that are usually determined by tenths or hundredths of a second. So how do you answer that, Blossom?
Absolutely. Respectfully, Dr. Phil, I'm going to need you to have several seats. Let's be clear. Trans women, again, are women. What you're showing me are male statistics, and trans women are not males. Everything that I said can actually be proven. It's scientifically proven. And I would inquire you to do research on what you're saying. Because again, it's almost like you're trying to call trans women men, and that is not what trans women are. Trans women work just as hard as cis women to compete. And when we talk about bone density levels, again, there are some women who are stronger and have faster agility than trans women. It is a case-by-case basis. I don't know why you're trying to group a group of trans people into one ideology that is false. It sounds like conservative propaganda. And I think you have drunk the Kool-Aid and have gotten lost in the sauce.
No,
I'm sorry, Dr. Phil. I'm going to disagree with you. And I think that the statistics that you've shown me prove nothing when it comes to trans women. Get up there and show me statistics specifically with trans women and cis women, and then we can revisit this conversation. Otherwise, I think you're being biased. I think that it is baloney and propaganda, and I think it needs to be fixed.
Okay, let me respond to that when we come back. Tonight we're talking about the conflict that is really tearing apart the world of women's sports. Should trans athletes be allowed to compete? Now, first off, I want to say one thing. I think trans athletes should absolutely be allowed to compete. Listen, I grew up as an athlete, and but for being in team sports and being able to compete, I'd have been in a lot of trouble. I'd have been lost. I don't think trans athletes should be denied the wonderful world of athletics and competition. The question is, where should they compete and who should they compete against? Now, Blossom is saying, look, there may be differences between biological men and biological women, but we're talking about transgender athletes, not male athletes competing against female athletes. Blossom, you'd give me that male athletes versus biological male athletes versus biological female athletes, of course, that's not fair. But you're saying that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about transgenders that have gone through a lot of hormonal suppression therapy, testosterone blockers for years, sometimes a minimum of 2, according to the NCAA now, and some for much longer than that, right? And you're saying, okay, let's talk about those comparisons. And I do want to talk about those because Dr. Carol Hooven from Harvard University, she is very much supportive of the transgender population across the board. She did a meta-analysis of like 50 different studies looking at hormone suppression therapy and testosterone blockers. And the conclusion of looking at over 50 studies was that after testosterone blockers, there's only about a 5 to 10% drop in muscle mass, and that there's no evidence whatsoever that these advantages reduce to the extent that it would match a female-bodied person. And the reason is that trans women who block testosterone do not remove initial male advantages. It doesn't change wingspan. It doesn't change post-pubescent male's anatomy. And there are only slight changes. At the most, you start with a difference of about 45% across the board in lean body mass, 40% in upper muscle mass, 33% in lower body muscle mass, 83% in tendon resistance, 30% in cardiac output. And the most you're going to get is a 10% reduction, and that doesn't even almost get to a level playing field. So even with hormone therapy and testosterone blockers, particularly post-pubescent, it doesn't level the playing field at all. So what you're saying is not supported by the science. The advantages of height, wingspan, bone strength, larger heart, and greater lung volume, the only thing that seems to equate is hemoglobin. Other than that, it just simply doesn't equate.
I disagree, Dr. Phil, because again, I'm questioning for the trans people that they study, when there's only less than 10 trans athletes in the NCAA. Like, that is what I really want to know. It sounds like there's a lot of bias in this research, and I would actually like to study up on it myself and really figure out what's going on here. I think it's very dangerous to try to weaponize these statistics against trans women who are trying to play in sports, mainly because of safety concerns. And I think we got to be really clear. There is a lot more research that still needs to be done. And we also just have to be very, very careful when we talk about research like that. I think we're still light years away from really finding out the truth.
Well, I think she was very careful about this, and I think you should study her research so you could talk. I think if you look at it,
study it.
I think you should look at it, and then you can talk about it and see if you find flaws in it. We have to take a quick break. Another trans woman who is going against her own community, we're going to find out why next. Sarah is a transgender activist that's challenging the very community that she's part of. She believes biological advantages create an uneven playing field in women's sports and says she's proof of that. Sarah is now 37 and self-described post-trans activist and athlete. Sarah, you've been listening to everything. What did you want to add?
Yeah, so obviously I think that there's no amount of hormones that you can take that will ever erase the biological advantage that you have. especially by going through male puberty. But even we know before male puberty, males still have an advantage when it comes to, lung capacity and hip angles and all that stuff that goes with being biologically male. I think, it's interesting. Blossom would bring up Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas is a prime example of why you can never erase this advantage. See, Leah Thomas, so in elite swimming, there is a 11% difference between male and female athletes in the elite areas. Leah Thomas, between swimming from male and then swimming in the female category, only lost 2.3% of their time, of their performance. So they didn't even come anywhere near meeting that. And that's how Leah Thomas went from 500 in the men's category to #1 in the female category.
Well, one thing that Dr. Hooven pointed out is that if you take all of the hormone suppression therapy and testosterone blockers, the best that you can hope for is you're going to have, maybe 3 or 4%. After 3 years of testosterone blocks, muscle mass drops an average of 3 to 5%. And hemoglobin does stabilize, but that when you've got a 40% difference in muscle mass, 3 to 5% doesn't make much difference. So you're still going to have a huge advantage, and you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that I'm kind of proof of this too. I grew up an athlete. I've been an athlete. I was wrestling since the time I was 4 years old, all the way through high school. I was an all-state wrestler. I joined the Army right after that. I started transitioning in 2019. And in 2020, I started going to the gym. And then after a year of being on hormones and everything like that, I'd never touched a spin bike in my life. And within 6 months, I was pushing power numbers, like max power numbers that would have been within the 80th percentile among females.
Hold that thought for a second, because we've got to take a break. Sarah says being transgender is a result of a mental illness. And Blossom, of course, completely disagrees with that. We'll talk about that after the break. Sarah, you believe that you do suffer from gender dysphoria.
Yes, I do.
And you believe that that's something that women that are transgender have to acknowledge?
Yeah, I think you have to acknowledge that there's a difference between trans women and women. You can't change your sex biologically. Trans women are males, which makes them a subsection of men. And because the definition, like postmodernists want to erase the definition of what it is to be a man. If you can't, define what a man or woman is without using the term or saying that it's just simple feeling, something that you can't measure, then that doesn't make sense. And so an adult human female is a woman, an adult human male is a man. I just think the term trans woman to identify like who I am and who Blossom would be is more apt, because that would show that it's more indicative to show how we live our lives and present ourselves to society, but you cannot change your sex.
I 100% disagree with Sarah. Listen, being trans is not a mental illness, okay? Now, I'm somebody who has experienced gender dysphoria, but not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. There are some trans people that just transition socially, mentally, emotionally, and they may not like a physical transition, and that's okay too. They are not less trans just because they choose that route. Trans women are women. It's point blank and the simple. And I think that weaponizing it into conservative propaganda is a detriment to the trans community. And again, I talk so much about safety because we have to live with this. It creates a domino effect when we spew rhetoric that can become so hateful and that people propagandize against us. And so I just really want us to be really careful with the language. When we talk about mental illness, okay, there are people out there that truly suffer with mental illness. Mental illness has more to do with poor health. It has to do with poor health, excuse me. And dysphoria has more to do with an abnormality. And with trans people, their gender identity can feel like an abnormality because they are feeling like their outside body should be aligned with how they feel on the inside. And for a lot of us, being able to take hormones and being able to transition is the way for us. And again, when we talk about bone density levels, there is no actual way that you can measure somebody's bone density level and just call it research. I'm sorry, the size of somebody's lungs, heart, and other organs in their body cannot determine somebody's agility and their vitality. And so I stand 10 toes down on that. And I just think that we got to be really careful when we talk about mental illness and trans people. Trans people are not an ideology. We are real. We are here, and we're not going anywhere, even under a Trump administration.
And Linnea, you feel strongly about this because you've been in the situation of having to compete in what you believe are unfair circumstances. So it's not a political issue for you, it's a real life issue for you, Linnea, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I completely value Blossom's opinion on the matters. I hope she values mine as well. There are a multitude of different things that need to be studied and looked into as we continue discussing this manner. But as it is right now, I agree. I don't think there's enough research. I don't think that we should be making starch decisions about different categories of things of that nature. It becomes very unfair. However, conversations like this are exactly what we need to be continuing doing, seeing different points of view from different individuals with different ideas of what is fair and what's not fair. And from there, we can make decisions that are not exclusive to anybody. I truly want to find inclusivity for all, especially when it comes to sports and being able to do what people want to do and find fairness in that for everyone.
My final thoughts next. Sarah, you believe that sports have played a really important role in your life, right?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, you said you've wrestled since 4.
Yeah, I've been competing my whole life.
When you've been in sports all your life, can you imagine not having that experience, not having that camaraderie that comes from team sports sometimes, not having the thrill of competition, all of that? And I think it would be terrible if that's taken away from any segment of the population, transgender or otherwise. Transgender individuals, there's no way they should not have the camaraderie that comes from competition, not have the experience, the discipline and achievement that comes from being able to compete in sports and athletics. You know, Blossom, I think that would be terrible. We need to find a way that it works for everybody. The friends that you make, the experiences that you have, the lessons you learn, that shouldn't be taken away from any segment of the population, including the transgender population. No way do I want that to be taken away from you or anyone. That just should not happen. We got to find a way to make that work. And so understand, I get that. I don't want that to be taken away. Living transgender in a world where you are a distinct minority is tough enough without taking that away. That's how I feel about it anyway.
Yeah, nobody's trying to tell trans athletes that they can't compete. You know, they want it to be fair. There should be an open category for trans athletes to be able to compete in. Unfortunately, what we've even seen with like the Boston Marathon and stuff like that is the trans athletes end up still competing with women because the open category ends up becoming all the mediocre men.
Again, trans women should definitely play in sports against women. You know, the number of trans people that are in sports, it's so small. So there can't be anything created specifically just for trans people. Trans people will have to go along with the crowd. And in this case, trans women would have to go along with cis women. I think it's kind of weird how trans men do not experience the same type of trauma that trans women athletes do. And I find it very interesting how trans men athletes can almost get a pass in sports versus trans women athletes. And I think that's something that we have to kind of wake up within ourselves as well, too. I think because of the political climate that we live in, trans women are faced with so much hatred for no reason. We're only 1% of the population. But because you have someone like Donald Trump in power, who is using trans people to scapegoat his own issues, it's falling back on us. And it's becoming dangerous as just a trans person living in this world. And I think what needs to happen is we have to continue to allow trans women to play in sports. We have to continue to look at all of the science and the statistics. Because again, there's only less than 10 trans athletes in the NCAA. So having to make an executive order just based on that is wild to me. Leah Thomas, again, was beaten by cis women, which means that there are cis women that have a competitive edge than Leah Thomas, and it debunks that trans women have a competitive edge over cis women. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Blossom, thank you for your time and thank you for sharing. Well, it's certainly a very complex issue, and I absolutely do not support transgender athletes in women's sports. I never have. I've said it very clearly. I've said it loud. I've said it long. I continue to say it now that there is good science. It is solid science, and it just says you cannot do enough hormonal therapy or testosterone blockers to level the playing field, even if you start prepubescently, but you certainly can't if you do it post-pubescent. So there's just no way. Tonight's conversation went longer than the usual episodes, and you can hear it all on the Dr. Phil podcast, which you can download, subscribe, follow, and listen to all new Dr. Phil podcasts for free on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and on your favorite podcast app. I want to give a special thanks to my guest tonight for a really intelligent conversation. Linnea, thank you so much. Thank you, Blossom. Sarah, thank you so much, all for your input, and thank all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.